Welcome, listeners, to another journey into the untamed frontier. Today's tale is one of unexpected arrivals, desperate promises, and the quiet strength it takes to build a life from the ground up when all seems completely lost. Will a dying man's final, desperate request be enough to forge a lasting bond between two total strangers in a harsh, unforgiving land? If you enjoy this type of content, do not forget to subscribe to our channel, Wildwood Hearts. We post new videos every single day. Please leave a like on this video if you enjoy the story, and let us know in the comments exactly where you are from and what time you are listening to us. His name was Silas Thorne. He was 36 years old, dwelling in complete and unwavering solitude on a sun-scorched expanse of untamed land, situated just east of Oak Haven, Colorado territory. It was an unforgiving place where the rushing Oak Haven River carved its way relentlessly through the ancient red rock, leaving a deep gorge that looked like a jagged wound permanently etched into the earth. The property he claimed as his own was incredibly modest, offering very little in the way of comfort or luxury. It consisted merely of a sturdy but small one-room wooden cabin, a carefully tended vegetable patch that constantly struggled against the dry soil, a simple lean-to stable constructed from salvaged timber, and 2 resilient horses. Beyond his meager possessions, Silas possessed a formidable reputation that effectively kept the vast majority of people at a very comfortable distance. The harshness of the environment perfectly mirrored the solitary existence he had deliberately chosen, a life built entirely on self-reliance and quiet endurance, amidst the sweeping, desolate beauty of the vast Colorado landscape. He asked for nothing from the unforgiving land around him, and in return, he expected absolutely nothing but the hard-earned right to simply exist in peace. The local townsfolk rarely referred to him by his given name when they spoke of him in the bustling streets of Oak Haven. Instead, they spoke in hushed, respectful tones, calling him the solitary man who had single-handedly driven away 3 aggressive cattle rustlers at the Pine Ridge Crossing, using only his intimidating physical presence and unyielding resolve, never once cracking a smile throughout the entire tense ordeal. His physical appearance bore the undeniable, heavy evidence of a profoundly difficult life. His strong, square jaw resembled pieces of heavily weathered timber, and his piercing eyes held the exact gray color of a bleak, overcast winter sky. There was a profound, unnerving stillness about his overall demeanor, a quiet, watchful intensity that invariably made wandering strangers feel acutely uncomfortable whenever they found themselves in his presence. He had originally journeyed to the Oak Haven territory 8 long years ago, arriving with nothing more than a broken-down horse and a deeply fractured past, trailing heavily behind him. Through sheer willpower and grueling manual labor, he had painstakingly built a highly functional homestead straight out of the metaphorical rubble of his previous life. It was certainly not a grand estate by any stretch of the imagination, but it was just enough. It was enough to keep a solitary man breathing, and it provided just enough daily toil to keep the crushing weight of profound loneliness from becoming completely unbearable in the quiet, empty hours of the night. Silas had certainly not anticipated receiving any company on that particular Tuesday afternoon in late October. The tall aspen trees lining the steep canyon ridge had already transitioned into their vibrant autumnal gold, dropping leaves onto the dry earth, and the brisk biting wind had just begun to carry the undeniable, freezing first breath of the rapidly approaching winter season. He absolutely had not expected her sudden arrival. She approached his remote property entirely on foot, which was the very first peculiar detail that Silas's highly observant eyes registered as he watched her approach. There was no heavy traveling wagon accompanying her on the path, nor was there a riding horse anywhere in sight. There was merely a solitary young woman walking slowly and deliberately up the long, dusty dirt road. She moved cautiously through the fading, somber gray light of the late afternoon, desperately clutching a thick, heavy wool shawl tightly around her trembling shoulders. She held on to the woven fabric with white-knuckled desperation, gripping the coarse wool tightly in her hands as though it were the only tangible thing left in the entire world that was keeping her fragile form from completely shattering into pieces right then and there. The biting wind mercilessly whipped at the hem of her plain skirts, yet she continued her steady, determined march toward his solitary cabin. The weary traveler's name was Amelia Vance. She was the only daughter of a widely known man named Harrison Vance, a highly respected individual who had mercifully pulled Silas out of a devastating, life-threatening canyon flash flood exactly 7 years ago, asking for absolutely nothing in return for his immense, selfless bravery. Throughout his incredibly eventful life, Harrison had occupied many vital roles within the growing frontier community: a skilled animal trapper, a dedicated preacher's assistant, and a highly dependable part-time sheriff who firmly maintained order, using only his words and sheer authority. Above all of these various titles and occupations, however, Harrison Vance had ultimately been the exact kind of genuinely good, honorable man that this wild territory desperately required to thrive, yet so rarely managed to naturally produce on its own. Tragically, the benevolent older man had passed away a mere 3 weeks prior to this unexpected afternoon visit. A sudden, violent winter fever had quickly overtaken his notoriously sturdy constitution, ultimately claiming his life in a shockingly brief and agonizing span of just 4 short days. His sudden, permanent absence left a massive, unfillable void in the rough-and-tumble community, a heavy void that was felt most acutely by the solitary men who had silently relied on his unwavering moral compass over the years. Silas had respectfully stood by the man's freshly dug grave in complete and utter silence throughout the short memorial service. Comforting words had never come easily to his rough tongue, and the overwhelming, suffocating presence of deep communal grief proved to be absolutely no exception to this lifelong rule of silence. Now, remarkably, the deceased man's only daughter was standing nervously on the rough wooden floorboards of Silas's own front porch, completely unannounced. She appeared to be perhaps 24 years of age, with her simple brown hair practically pinned back tightly against her head, completely devoid of any foolish vanity or decorative combs. Her exhausted eyes were visibly red and puffy from weeks of endless private crying, although they remained remarkably dry at this exact, incredibly tense moment in time. She wore the distinct, hollow look of someone who had entirely exhausted their physical capacity for tears and had subsequently replaced that overwhelming sorrow with something much harder, colder, and far more resilient to the harsh realities of the world. Silas quickly noted that her sturdy leather walking boots were tragically worn all the way down to the very sole on the left foot from miles of hard walking. Furthermore, she was defensively holding a tightly folded piece of worn paper flat against her chest, treating the delicate parchment exactly as if it were an impenetrable protective shield. Upon noticing her quiet approach, Silas immediately ceased his grueling manual labor and stepped slowly out from the shadowed side of the wooden cabin, exactly where he had spent the past few hours painstakingly mending a broken, splintered fence post. He deliberately stopped his forward momentum precisely 10 feet away from where she stood shivering on his property, offering her plenty of space. He actively chose not to speak her given name aloud in greeting, primarily because he honestly was not entirely sure if she even remembered his silent, brooding presence from her father's deeply somber funeral service weeks ago. Instead of immediately speaking, he simply leveled his steady, gray gaze upon her weary face and patiently waited for her to make the first move. He waited with the distinct, heavy patience of a solitary man who instinctively senses that something incredibly significant, perhaps even completely life-altering, is just about to be spoken into existence between them. Amelia maintained her rigid position, bravely looking back into his weathered, emotionless face for a remarkably long, tense moment. She hesitantly opened her mouth once to speak, quickly closed it again as her courage momentarily faltered, and visibly swallowed hard to clear the nervous lump forming in her dry throat. The crisp, biting autumn air hung thick with unsaid words between the two cautious strangers. Gathering her final, desperate reserves of fading strength, she slowly lowered her red-rimmed eyes to stare intently at the scuffed porch boards directly beneath her worn boots, and she finally spoke in a trembling, fragile voice that barely registered above the howling canyon wind. "My father said you needed a wife," she stated clearly, dropping the incredibly heavy words straight into the freezing afternoon air. Silas offered absolutely no immediate vocal response to this shocking, unprecedented declaration. He simply said nothing at all. All around them, the dying yellow aspen leaves rustled violently in the cold breeze, and a solitary black raven called out sharply from somewhere hidden high up on the jagged rocky ridge overlooking the homestead. He purposefully let the incredibly heavy, awkward silence sit thickly between them for a long, drawn-out moment, carefully weighing the immense gravity of her spoken words, before he finally answered her. His deep voice was remarkably steady, richly resonant, and as undeniably plain as the hard canyon stone surrounding their feet. "Maybe," he said softly, pausing just a fraction of a second to let the word land before simply adding, "You." The sheer, unvarnished simplicity of his brief response seemed to echo loudly against the wooden walls of the small cabin. Amelia's downcast head snapped up so incredibly fast that she very nearly lost the heavy wool shawl draped protectively over her trembling shoulders. Her red, exhausted eyes were suddenly blown wide open, actively swimming with a highly complex, swirling mixture of profound confusion and a sharp, desperate flicker of hope that she had strictly forbidden herself from feeling for the past 3 agonizing weeks. She had quite clearly not mentally prepared herself to receive that specific, remarkably compliant answer from a man known for his harshness. In her anxious mind, she had heavily prepared for a brutal refusal, for condescending pity, or quite possibly even for immediate, righteous anger at her immense audacity for showing up uninvited. She had absolutely not prepared herself for 2 simple words spoken with the quiet, unwavering weight of a solemn promise. Shaking her head rapidly in sheer disbelief, she pressed the folded piece of paper even harder against her chest, her knuckles turning white. "You don't understand," she practically gasped, her voice thick with rising panic. "I don't have anything. Father's lingering debts mercilessly took the family house. I currently owe 3 full months of rent on my tiny room at the Silverwood boarding house, and Mrs. Martha Higgins says she'll ruthlessly throw my trunk into the muddy street by this coming Friday." She forcefully paused her frantic, panicked rambling, and when she finally locked her gaze with his once more, there was a sudden glaring fierceness burning brightly in her eyes that sharply and instantly reminded Silas of the late, great Harrison Vance. "I'm not standing here asking you for free charity," she declared firmly, her voice finally losing its previous tremble and finding a bedrock of absolute certainty. "Father specifically wrote this out for you before he passed away." With a shaking but determined hand, she nervously held out the folded piece of worn paper directly toward his chest. Silas smoothly closed the remaining distance between them, crossing the wooden porch in 3 long, deliberate strides, and gently took the delicate parchment from her fragile grasp. The cramped, highly deliberate handwriting undeniably belonged to Harrison. Silas instantly recognized the distinct, unique script from the late man's meticulously kept field notes over the years. It read exactly, "Silas, my Amelia is far too proud to ever ask for help, and entirely too good a person to ever need it. But cruel circumstances have unfortunately made terrible liars out of far better people than her. I have specifically instructed her to go directly to you. I fully know exactly what I am asking of you. I know exactly what kind of man you truly are inside. Look after her. That is all I ask. H. Vance." Silas carefully and respectfully folded the delicate piece of paper back along its original creases, tucking it safely away. He silently looked out toward the distant, towering canyon ridge for a long, deeply contemplative moment, letting the weight of the letter settle into his bones. A solitary hawk was actively turning in slow, graceful circles high up in the freezing air, gliding effortlessly above the jagged red rock formations in search of prey. When he finally spoke again, he did so while keeping his gaze fixed firmly on the distant horizon, actively avoiding looking directly at her face. "Your noble father once carried my broken body 8 agonizing miles through the flooded valley with a severely broken shoulder, simply because I was physically unable to ride my own horse through the deep mud. He performed this grueling task in the pitch dark, in the freezing rain, and he miraculously didn't utter a single complaint the entire time. He then sat faithfully beside my cot for 2 straight nights, while a deadly fever actively fought to take my life. He never once asked me for a single thing in return for his immense sacrifice." Amelia's pale lips pressed tightly together as she fully absorbed this profound, previously unknown revelation. "He didn't tell me that story," she whispered softly into the wind. "He wouldn't have." Silas finally turned his intense gray gaze back upon her shivering form. "How long before the harsh boarding house firmly puts you out onto the street?" he asked plainly. 4 days, she replied quietly, her voice devoid of hope. "Do you have any other living family anywhere in this territory?" he pressed. Further, She silently shook her head in sheer defeat. "Then come inside," he instructed softly. Her stubborn chin instantly went up in a highly defensive posture. "I told you clearly. I'm not here asking for," she began, but he swiftly and gently interrupted her protest. "I know exactly what you're asking for," he stated with quiet, unshakable conviction, "and I know exactly what it is that I'm offering. Come inside, Miss Vance. The freezing winter wind is rapidly picking up. Thank you so much for listening to our story thus far, dear listeners. We deeply appreciate your time and your presence here with us today. If you are enjoying this journey into the frontier, please remember to subscribe to our channel, Wildwood Hearts. What do you think is going to happen next with this sudden, unexpected arrangement? Will the harsh winter break their spirits, or will they find a way to survive the bitter frost together? Let us know all your thoughts and predictions in the comments down below. They cautiously took their seats on completely opposite sides of an incredibly rough-hewn wooden table, with a freshly brewed, steaming pot of dark coffee placed carefully between them like a fragile peace offering. The interior of the small cabin was entirely spare and highly utilitarian, containing only a simple sleeping cot, a heavy cast-iron warming stove, a single wooden shelf lined with worn books, and 2 glass oil lamps. Amelia sat remarkably still with her cold hands folded neatly in her lap, her exhausted eyes actively scanning and examining absolutely everything in the dim room except for Silas's face. He slowly poured the hot, dark coffee into a battered tin cup, deliberately set it down on the table directly in front of her, and silently waited for her to process the warmth. She finally reached out and picked the cup up, gripping the hot tin tightly with both of her shaking hands, as if it were something profoundly warm and comforting that she had absolutely not expected to find in this desolate place. He spoke to her in a plain, straightforward manner, stating clearly that he was absolutely not offering her free charity, as the sprawling land was simply far too much for one solitary man to adequately work all the way through the harsh winter. The vital vegetable garden was rapidly failing purely for a lack of proper attention, and he frankly admitted that he could not possibly keep the complex financial accounts straight, manage the demanding horses, and fix whatever physical things were constantly breaking on the homestead all at once. He paused briefly, recalling that her late father had once mentioned that her mother ran a household with the strict discipline of a military general running a campaign, and that Amelia had successfully learned those exact same formidable skills from her. Amelia immediately looked up from her warm coffee cup, visibly surprised by this unexpected revelation. He continued speaking, recounting how her father had proudly boasted that she could expertly bake perfect bread in the middle of a howling windstorm and ruthlessly negotiate with a seasoned town merchant, just like a strict circuit judge. A small, incredibly involuntary expression swiftly crossed her weary face. It was not quite a full smile, but it was remarkably close to one, though it tragically disappeared just as quickly as it had arrived. She cautiously asked him what exactly he was proposing with this conversation. Silas set both of his large, calloused hands completely flat on the wooden table and calmly proposed a formal legal arrangement, specifically a simple civil ceremony, and absolutely nothing more than that, unless they both mutually decided otherwise far down the road. He assured her that she would proudly maintain her own private space, her own personal standing, and the absolute legal right to comfortably remain on his property. In direct return for this guaranteed shelter and security, she would simply help him run the demanding household and manage the complex financial accounts. Amelia remained incredibly quiet for a very long, tense moment, silently watching the delicate white steam rising slowly from the dark coffee in her tin cup. She softly pointed out that the local townspeople would inevitably gossip and talk about them, to which Silas practically replied that people always talked, but their idle gossip absolutely never changed the harsh weather or improved the autumn harvest. She finally looked at him directly for the very first time since entering the small cabin, her eyes searching his face for any hidden motives, and asked him why he would willingly do this for someone he did not even truly know. He simply replied that he had deeply known her honorable father, and that fact alone was entirely enough for him. She stared blankly at the rough wooden table while outside, the freezing autumn wind pushed aggressively against the heavy wooden window shutters. The flickering oil lamp cast a distinctly warm, unsteady yellow light across her pale, exhausted face. At long last, she drew an incredibly deep, heavy breath into her lungs and simply asked when the proposed event would take place. Silas decisively answered that it would happen on Thursday, as the traveling circuit judge consistently came through Oak Haven every Thursday morning. He reassured her that the entire legal process was genuinely as simple and straightforward as signing a standard land deed. Amelia looked at him one final time, intensely studying his incredibly still face, his careful, observant gray eyes, and the remarkably grounded way he sat completely still without fidgeting, resembling a stoic man who had thoroughly learned immense patience the absolute hardest way possible. With a heavy heart but a clear mind, she slowly offered him a single definitive nod of agreement. The promised Thursday morning unfortunately arrived enveloped in a bitter, biting cold. A thin, fragile skim of clear ice had completely formed overnight on the surface of the wooden water trough, and the tall aspen trees had decisively lost the vast majority of their vibrant gold leaves to an aggressive, howling, overnight wind. Silas predictably woke up well before the dawn had even broken, which was absolutely not an unusual occurrence for his demanding lifestyle. What was highly unusual, however, was that he actually took the precious time to properly groom his facial hair. He dug through his limited belongings and miraculously found a perfectly clean shirt safely tucked away inside the heavy wooden trunk located at the foot of his sleeping cot. The shirt was made of dark, heavy wool, specifically chosen by his late mother years ago, and typically reserved for quiet Sundays that he no longer bothered to observe. He carefully pulled the warm garment on and briefly examined his rough reflection in a polished piece of metal, which served as the absolute closest thing to a proper mirror that the Spartan cabin currently possessed. He undeniably looked exactly like what he truly was, a rugged, solitary man who had lived an incredibly hard life outdoors for the vast majority of his existence. When he finally stepped out of the small cabin into the freezing morning air, Amelia was already patiently standing by the mended wooden fence. She was beautifully dressed in a surprisingly elegant gown, the exact color of wild winter sage, a deeply muted gray-green fabric that was highly modest at the collar. The dress featured delicate small pearl buttons running straight down the front bodice that perfectly caught the pale early morning sunlight. The fine garment had quite clearly been meticulously pressed and prepared the night before. She had also carefully arranged her brown hair differently, cleanly pinning it back at the sides while leaving the remainder flowing loosely down her back. She stood incredibly straight and tall in the freezing air with her hands firmly at her sides, looking absolutely nothing like the devastated, exhausted woman who had originally arrived just 4 short days ago, with worn-through leather boots and profound despair weighing heavily on her slender shoulders. Silas completely stopped in his tracks, momentarily stunned, and simply told her that she looked remarkably well. Amelia briefly glanced down at the beautiful sage dress and softly explained that it had originally belonged to her mother, proudly calling it the only genuinely good thing she had managed to bring with her. Silas quietly assured her that it was more than enough. They swiftly drove together into the bustling town of Oak Haven in his sturdy wooden supply wagon. The rapidly growing town was already incredibly busy with daily commerce. Heavy freighters were actively unloading massive wooden crates at the general mercantile store. A local blacksmith was loudly hammering red-hot iron on his anvil, and 2 young boys were joyfully racing each other along the raised wooden boardwalk. The traveling circuit judge, a remarkably barrel-chested, deeply pragmatic man named Aldous Thorne, promptly received them in the dusty back room of the local land office. The judge carried the distinct, weary air of an official who had already officiated 50 such practical arrangements and ultimately found them all to be equally routine and unromantic. There was one necessary witness present, a rugged animal trapper named Arthur Cole, who simply happened to be waiting patiently for a property deed of his own and easily agreed to sign their legal paperwork in exchange for a few small coins and a hot cup of coffee. The incredibly brief legal ceremony lasted exactly 9 minutes from start to finish. When Judge Thorne officially declared that they could now consider the legal matter completely settled, Amelia nervously looked at Silas, and Silas steadily looked back at Amelia. Neither of them moved a single muscle for a long, heavy moment. Then, Silas formally offered her his strong arm. She gently took it, and they walked completely back out into the freezing Oak Haven morning as husband and wife. It was undeniably the quietest, most remarkably ordinary, and simultaneously the most profoundly significant single thing Silas had ever done in his 36 years. The critical first few weeks of their new living arrangement involved an incredibly careful, highly delicate negotiation of shared space and daily habits. Silas purposefully rose well before the dawn broke and exhausted himself working the unforgiving land until the sky turned completely dark. Meanwhile, Amelia entirely reorganized the small cabin with an intense, unwavering focus that heavily bordered on strict military precision. She brilliantly established a highly complex logical system for the homestead's financial accounts that actually took Silas 3 full days to properly understand, but which he subsequently could not possibly imagine ever having lived without. She successfully repaired the damaged wire fencing on the chicken coop, ruthlessly negotiated a much better bulk price for vital winter wheat at the Oakhaven Mercantile, and consistently produced incredibly hearty, delicious meals out of a half-bare wooden pantry. Her remarkable culinary skills caused Silas to look up from his dinner plate in sheer amazement more than once, constantly wearing an expression that he desperately hoped passed for completely neutral. They were both incredibly careful with one another, behaving exactly the way two strangers naturally do when they both fully recognize that their current arrangement is highly fragile, and absolutely neither of them wants to be the one responsible for accidentally breaking it. Amelia strictly kept to her designated side of the small cabin, and Silas respectfully kept to his. They primarily talked during their shared evening suppers, safely discussing highly practical things such as the changing weather, the health of the livestock, and upcoming supply lists. But slowly, completely without either of them consciously deciding to actually allow it, their nightly conversation organically stretched and deepened. She eventually told him all about growing up in the lush Oregon territory, constantly following her restless father across 3 massive states as he continually worked one demanding trade and then completely shifted to another. In direct exchange, he told her, in the highly sparse, economical way he always told things, about originally coming out to the Colorado territory from Missouri with only $40 to his name. He explained how his only horse had tragically perished just 2 days after he finally arrived, leaving him with nothing but a stubborn, unyielding conviction that this wild territory owed him absolutely nothing, and that he therefore owed it absolutely everything. She softly observed one evening that he truly did not ask the world for very much, which was not quite phrased as a question. He frankly replied that actively asking for things merely invites profound disappointment. Amelia intently looked at him across the wooden table in the warm lamplight, and quietly shared that her father used to firmly say that men who genuinely expect absolutely nothing from the harsh world are usually the exact ones who truly deserve the most from it. Silas deeply considered her words, looking intently at her for a very long, incredibly even moment. He then slowly picked up his hot coffee cup and quietly stated that her father was frequently a very correct man. Amelia actually laughed out loud at his dry response. It was a highly quiet, incredibly brief sound, and she genuinely seemed quite surprised by it herself, but it completely changed the heavy air inside the small cabin. After that particular evening, the long silences hanging between them felt distinctly different. They felt far less like an unbridgeable distance, and much more like the comfortable, easy kind of quiet that two people comfortably share when they have finally stopped acting like total strangers. Unfortunately, the fragile peace was eventually disrupted by a powerful local woman named Margaret Sterling, who consciously decided to make their lives incredibly difficult. Margaret was the wealthy widow of a prominent man who had previously owned the absolute largest, most profitable cattle operation situated directly north of the Oakhaven River. Ever since her husband's passing 3 years prior, Margaret had ruthlessly run the massive ranch herself, with an iron precision that most men in the territory grudgingly admired and privately deeply feared. She had also, over the past 2 years, made several highly aggressive lowball offers to purchase Silas's small plot of land. His property was a crucial wedge of land that unfortunately abutted her northern pasture and absolutely controlled the only reliable, year-round creek access for miles around, and Silas had firmly refused her every single time. Margaret suddenly appeared uninvited at the small cabin on a particularly gray, freezing December morning, conspicuously arriving in a highly polished, black-lacquered buggy that looked completely absurd and wildly out of place on the rough dirt canyon road. She was perhaps 50 years old, impeccably dressed in thick, expensive dark wool and heavy silver jewelry, constantly wearing the kind of highly composed, arrogant expression that comes exclusively from years of flawlessly winning every single argument. Amelia bravely opened the front door to greet her. Margaret immediately looked her up and down with a slow, highly deliberate, and insulting appraisal, judging everything from her plain dress to her worn boots, and then mockingly stated in the absolute sweetest possible voice that she must be the new arrangement. Amelia wisely said nothing at all, merely opening the heavy door slightly wider. Silas then came inside from his outdoor chores, completely stopping when he saw Margaret standing on his porch. Margaret condescendingly mentioned that she had heard he had taken a new wife under rather peculiar circumstances, aggressively hinting that a destitute girl and a lonely man were merely a highly practical, unromantic pairing. She then falsely claimed that his specific property was currently sitting entirely under a highly disputed water claim, and that the Regional Cattle Association possessed the absolute legal right to completely reroute the vital creek that directly fed his arid land. It was an absolute blatant lie, and Silas instantly knew it, but it was the exact kind of incredibly expensive lie that would cost endless money and lawyers to properly disprove. Margaret pleasantly suggested that he simply sell the land to her right now at a fair market price, allowing him and his new bride to avoid massive complications, but Amelia bravely stepped forward, her voice remarkably quiet and even. She firmly thanked Margaret for the incredibly rude visit, but coldly reminded her that the dangerous road back into town was much easier to navigate before the sun went down, prompting the wealthy woman to finally drive away with a sinister, lingering threat hanging in the air. The inevitable trouble finally arrived on their doorstep exactly 3 weeks later, striking in the absolute dead of a freezing January night. Silas abruptly woke up in the pitch-black darkness to the highly distinct, acrid smell of heavy smoke long before his ears actually picked up any other sounds. It was that highly particular, unnatural chemical sharpness that was absolutely not the comforting wood smoke coming from a standard heating stove, but rather something significantly larger, indicating that something substantial was being aggressively consumed that absolutely should not be burning. He threw off his blankets and was outside in the freezing air in under 30 seconds. The vital hay barn was fiercely burning, with bright orange flames having already completely taken over the entire east wall of the wooden structure. The destructive fire was rapidly climbing upward toward the wooden roof, with the lazy, terrifying confidence of a destructive force that firmly knows it is going to win the battle. He shouted loudly just once toward the small cabin to alert Amelia, and immediately began sprinting desperately toward the heavy iron water pump located in the yard. Amelia came rushing out closely behind him, clutching a heavy wool blanket and a large metal water bucket before he even had the time to call out her name a second time. They relentlessly worked together side by side for an agonizing, grueling hour in the freezing, pitch-black darkness, with him furiously working the heavy iron pump and her desperately hauling heavy buckets of freezing water, both of them violently coughing and gasping for breath in the thick, smoke-filled winter air. They miraculously managed to save the primary structure of the barn, but only barely. The entire east wall was completely gone, reduced to nothing but blackened, charred timber, and the vital winter hay stored inside had been mostly turned into useless gray ash. The only genuinely fortunate thing about the entire disastrous ordeal was that the 2 draft horses had been left out in the snowy pasture for the night, rather than locked inside the burning structure. When the frantic firefighting was finally over and the flames were completely extinguished, they silently stood, shoulder to shoulder in the deep snow, and simply stared blankly at the smoking, ruined remains of the critical building. Amelia's pale, exhausted face was heavily streaked with dark soot and ash, and her bare hands were bright red and completely numb from the freezing water and the biting winter wind. She was visibly shaking from head to toe, not entirely from the freezing cold, as Silas deeply understood, but rather from the highly particular, profound physical exhaustion that exclusively comes immediately after sustaining a massive, desperate physical effort to survive. He silently walked over, found her heavy winter coat exactly where she had hastily dropped it in the snow upon rushing out of the cabin, and gently draped it securely around her trembling shoulders to ward off the chill. She absolutely did not thank him right away, as her eyes were rigidly fixed on the ruined wooden wall with a deeply intense expression that had completely moved past simple upset and transitioned directly into something significantly colder and far more purposeful. She stared at the smoldering wreckage and flatly stated that Margaret Sterling had definitively done this terrible thing, her voice carrying the heavy weight of an absolute certainty, rather than phrasing it as a simple question. Silas said absolutely nothing for a long, calculating moment, silently processing her accusation before finally stating that he would ride directly into the town of Oakhaven at first light to address the situation. Amelia immediately countered by asking exactly what he could possibly say to the local authorities, logically pointing out that they currently had absolutely no physical proof of Margaret's direct involvement in the arson. Silas firmly replied that they would simply have to find the necessary proof before they left. He slowly walked over and carefully examined the heavily scorched wooden beam exactly where the intense fire had clearly originated. He deliberately did not look at the heating stove connection, nor did he examine the oil lamp storage line. Instead, he crouched down and closely inspected the base of the exterior wooden wall, where the melting snow heavily surrounding the area still carried the absolutely unmistakable, pungent mineral stink of highly flammable kerosene. Amelia closely followed his intense gaze, processing the evidence before looking back at his soot-stained face, and sharply asking who a wealthy woman like Margaret would have possibly hired to do such a dirty, dangerous task. Silas quietly explained that there was a local rough-hewn man named Jasper Dunn, who frequently ran shady errands for the massive Sterling cattle operation, a reckless individual who had already been in serious trouble with the town sheriff on 2 previous occasions. He spoke the man's name incredibly quietly, his sharp mind already calculating 3 definitive moves ahead, exactly the way a highly resilient man operates when he has been forcefully pushed, completely past his immense patience and directly into forming a solid plan of action. Amelia pulled her heavy winter coat tightly around her slender frame, looking at him with a remarkably strong expression he had absolutely not seen from her before. It was entirely devoid of any fragile gratitude or helpless dependence, but was instead something vastly closer to a true, equal partnership. She firmly declared that she would be riding into town right alongside him at first light. Sheriff Clayton Briggs was a highly methodical, deeply serious man who entirely ran the local law enforcement of Oakhaven. He absolutely did not move quickly or make rash decisions, but he always moved surely and decisively. And when Silas carefully laid out all the physical evidence he had painstakingly gathered, the distinct kerosene pour pattern heavily melted into the snow, the specific direction of the heavy boot tracks leading away from the property, and a dropped metal canteen with a large, embossed letter S that he had found buried 20 yards from the ruined barn, the sheriff silently listened without interrupting him even once. After fully digesting the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, Sheriff Briggs simply stood up, pulled on his heavy winter coat and walked out the door completely without uttering a single word. Jasper Dunn was easily located highly intoxicated at the local Oakhaven saloon on Main Street at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. A pathetic fact that perfectly told its own completely damning story of his immense guilty conscience. Jasper was absolutely not the kind of resilient man who responded at all well to intense authoritative pressure, and the experienced sheriff was incredibly thorough in his intense verbal interrogation techniques. By exactly noon that very same day, a terrified and fully cooperative Jasper Dunn had officially given a signed, written statement firmly detailing his terrible crime. He fully confessed that the wealthy Margaret Sterling had secretly paid him exactly $40 in cash to completely torch the vital hay barn, instructing him to leave behind just enough devastating damage to fully convince Silas that remaining on the remote land was simply far more trouble and danger than it was financially worth. It naturally took exactly 2 full days for the shocking news of the deliberate arson to rapidly move through the entire town of Oakhaven, but in a small, isolated frontier community consisting of fewer than 300 souls in the dead winter of 1882. 2 days was more than enough time for absolutely everyone to hear about it. The local townspeople talked endlessly about the scandal. Some folks were genuinely surprised by the viciousness of the wealthy widow, but most people, exactly as Silas had quietly suspected, were not terribly shocked in the least. Over the past 3 years, Margaret Sterling had ruthlessly made countless bitter enemies throughout the entire territory with the exact same brutal efficiency that she readily applied to absolutely everything else she touched. The powerful Oakhaven Cattle Association, keenly sensing exactly which way the political wind was now rapidly blowing against the disgraced widow, highly quietly and swiftly withdrew their powerful financial and legal support of her fraudulent water claim, which had indeed been a complete fabricated fiction from the very beginning. Just as Silas had always firmly suspected, Amelia had actually traveled directly to the town land office completely by herself the very next morning, after the sheriff's successful arrest, specifically requesting a certified copy of absolutely every single recorded property deed and water right officially associated with their land boundaries. She brought the massive stack of complex paperwork back to the cabin and methodically spread the documents entirely across the rough wooden table that very evening, with the terrifying, intense calm of a skilled surgeon conducting a highly complex procedure. Utilizing her incredibly sharp mind, she quickly found 3 massive, undeniable legal discrepancies purposely hidden within Margaret's highly aggressive claimed property boundaries. She immediately drafted a formal, incredibly detailed letter addressing these blatant legal flaws directly to the powerful territorial land commissioner, writing it out in a handwriting so meticulously precise and arguing the complex legal points so incredibly well that Silas actually had to read the brilliant document twice just to fully comprehend its sheer perfection. Thoroughly impressed, he looked across the table and quietly asked her exactly where she had learned to write and argue complex legalities like that. She simply replied that her late father had strictly forced her to manually copy complex legal documents for handwriting practice, ever since she was 12 years old. She elaborated that he used to firmly say that a highly educated woman who could expertly read and interpret a complex contract was vastly harder for the cruel world to cheat than one who unfortunately could not. Silas stared at her in awe, silently thinking about the late Harrison Vance walking 8 grueling miles through the freezing rain with a badly injured man securely draped across his tired shoulders. He thought deeply about the profoundly good kind of person who purposefully raises such a resilient, highly capable daughter, exactly like the one sitting before him. He quietly stated to her that her father was absolutely right about everything, wasn't he? Amelia slowly looked up from the scattered legal papers, and a highly complex emotion rapidly passed across her pale face. It was initially sharp grief, but it quickly melted into something vastly warmer and far more comforting than simple sorrow. She softly replied that he was only almost completely right. She paused heavily before adding that her father had simply claimed that Silas was a lonely man who merely needed a wife, but she now firmly believed that he was really only half right about what Silas truly needed to survive this harsh life. The warm spring season arrived incredibly late to the sprawling Oakhaven Canyon that particular year, but when it finally broke through the frost, it arrived all at once in a magnificent explosion of vibrant color and life. The rushing river began running incredibly fast and bitterly cold with the heavy mountain snowmelt. The ancient red rock formations finally began actively warming under the bright, direct afternoon sun, and the massive vegetable garden that Amelia had painstakingly planned out through the long, dark January evenings finally began forcefully breaking through the ground. Vibrant, tiny green shoots rapidly pushed their way up through the rich, thawed Colorado soil, promising an incredibly bountiful summer harvest. Completely disgraced and thoroughly defeated by Amelia's brilliant legal maneuvering and the sheriff's undeniable evidence, Margaret Sterling hastily sold her massive cattle ranch in early March and permanently fled the territory completely without any formal ceremony or goodbyes. Absolutely no one in the bustling town of Oakhaven bothered to organize any sort of farewell gathering for the cruel woman. Silas methodically rebuilt the ruined east wall of the hay barn, using incredibly sturdy, fresh timber harvested directly from the high canyon ridge. Completely unprompted, and without ever being asked, Amelia meticulously painted the newly installed wood using a beautiful, deep red ochre wash. She proudly stepped back, admiring her hard work, and cheerfully stated that the vibrant color made the mended structure look exactly as if it had always been meant to look that specific way. Silas completely agreed with her assessment, deciding absolutely not to argue the point because the bright red barn undeniably looked vastly better than it ever had before. The profound, fundamental change that organically occurred between the two of them absolutely did not happen in any single dramatic moment of clarity. Instead, it happened exactly the way the long seasons naturally changed, incredibly gradually at first, and then suddenly becoming utterly and beautifully unmistakable to anyone who bothered to look. Silas initially noticed the profound shift on a freezing morning in late February. when Amelia thoughtfully brought a steaming cup of dark coffee entirely out to the distant property line where he was tirelessly working on mending a broken fence. They simply stood there completely together in the biting cold air, comfortably sipping the hot drink and silently watching the distant canyon ridge slowly illuminate while the bright morning sun steadily came up over the rocky horizon. Absolutely neither of them felt any nervous, pressing need to forcefully fill the quiet air by saying anything at all. Silas realized with a heavy, contented heart that he had absolutely not shared a comfortable, profoundly peaceful silence exactly like that with another living human being in over 8 long years. He noticed the deep connection again on a quiet evening when she softly read aloud to him directly from one of his worn books, specifically focusing on a highly complex passage discussing the true nature of human loyalty. She abruptly stopped reading midway through the long paragraph, closed the book, looked intensely directly into his gray eyes, and asked him if that was truly what he believed, that deep loyalty was merely a rigid logical choice rather than a profound, overwhelming emotional feeling. They completely abandoned the book and enthusiastically talked for 2 straight hours as the glass oil lamp slowly burned incredibly low and the iron heating stove gently clicked and popped as it cooled down for the night, with absolutely neither of them paying any attention whatsoever to the rapidly passing time. Silas absolutely did not tell her that he deeply loved her by delivering a massive, highly rehearsed, dramatic speech. Instead, he simply told her the honest truth on a standard, highly unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in early March while they were both covered in freezing mud, actively working together to mend a stubborn fence post. He said the incredibly heavy words remarkably plainly, in the exact same straightforward, practical way that he said absolutely everything else in his life, entirely without any unnecessary theatricality or nervous apologies for his bold feelings. Amelia immediately set her heavy wooden hammer down in the mud, completely stood up straight and looked directly at him for a profoundly long, emotionally charged moment. She softly replied that she already knew. Then, as if she were mentally correcting her own delayed response, she clearly stated that she deeply loved him too, admitting that she firmly believed she had actively loved him for quite a while now, but she simply hadn't been entirely certain if he would ever actually want to hear those specific words spoken out loud. Silas looked at her muddy, beautiful face and firmly stated that he wanted to hear those exact words from her absolutely every single day for the rest of his natural life. Amelia smiled widely, displaying the incredibly full, genuine kind of bright smile that completely reached all the way up into her exhausted eyes and permanently stayed there, radiating pure joy. She softly promised him that from now on, he absolutely would. By the time the warm summer months completely rolled into the rugged territory, Harrison Vance's remarkably resilient daughter and the solitary man he had desperately sent her to save were undoubtedly the absolute most talked-about couple living in the entire town of Oakhaven. The local townsfolk did not gossip out of mean-spirited scandal, but rather out of pure admiration for the massive, thriving vegetable garden that successfully fed over half of their struggling neighbors through an incredibly dry, unforgiving August drought. They were beloved for the joyous, lively barn dances that Amelia expertly organized and hosted on the very first Saturday of absolutely every single month, bringing life back to the isolated community. They were most profoundly talked about because of the miraculous way the harsh, unyielding man with the canyon-gray eyes had entirely stopped being someone that people were incredibly careful and nervous around, and had completely transformed into a highly respected community pillar whom absolutely everyone was genuinely overjoyed to see walking down the wooden boardwalk. Silas Thorne had originally arrived in the unforgiving Colorado territory with absolutely nothing to his name but blind stubbornness and a broken-down horse, completely failing to expect any true softness, equal partnership, or the highly particular peace that comes exclusively from deeply loving someone who actively chooses to stay by your side every single day. But the late, great Harrison Vance had fully known it all along. The incredibly wise older man had always inherently known exactly what would happen when he sent them to each other. That was the absolute truest thing about possessing genuine, unwavering human goodness. It successfully saw exactly what beautiful things were entirely possible, long before the struggling people involved could ever see it for themselves. Thank you so very much for listening to the end of this beautiful tale. When we truly reflect on Silas and Amelia's incredible journey, the profound message becomes crystal clear. Genuine goodness and unwavering hard work can miraculously transform even the absolute harshest, most desolate circumstances into a profoundly beautiful life, filled with deep love and community. Sometimes all it takes is trusting in the inherent goodness of others, just as Harrison Vance did, to completely change the trajectory of two lonely lives for the absolute better. If this beautiful story moved something deep within you today, we would be incredibly honored if you subscribe to our channel. Every single week we bring you more incredible tales from the wild frontier, stories full of grit, grace, and the quiet, extraordinary courage it took to build a meaningful life at the very edge of the known world. Hit that subscribe button and ride with us. We will always save you a warm seat right by the fire.